Hi, Vish.
I don't see any agenda items in the listed. Do you know if they're using a different document? I just posted it in the Slack as well.
That's a good question. Let me check.
Yeah. Or is it going to be totally open-ended? It seems like.
It just says to do, right?
Yeah, it's it is definitely that document, Wish.
It was more like a leading question to just ask, I was like, I thought that is the one.
I think if your question is if they're using that, that's, yeah, that is supposed to be the document.
Okay.
Yeah.
The reason for some of us who are in the SIG auto and the SIG release meetings, because we have a lot of PRs to review, if I was like looking at agenda items not being listed, maybe we could skip it, but not even sure what happens, right? Because most of it is open-ended and something or the other topic gets discussed. So I don't want to miss it too.
It says agenda to do.
Yeah.
Oh, is it the agenda to do? What is it to? What remains to be done?
I can share my screen quickly.
I think looks like
This is the agenda as far as I see.
Yeah.
And then they also have this, right?
Hello, everyone. Sana joined here.
Hey, Sana.
Hi.
Long time. I haven't heard you in a while.
Yes.
I'll stop sharing.
It's all good, Pim. Did Kaushik made it, or is Kaushik not coming here?
Looks like he's not able to make it because of his baby duties.
I know. I heard that. I have an agenda in mind. I would just like to share it here in the chat window so that everybody can read that. And I discussed this agenda with Kaushik, and we had agreed that we will be discussing these, and then we have some next steps to go through together, for which I will sync up with Kaushik during this week sometime. So can somebody fill me in? What did we discuss in the last meeting?
I believe from my recollection, there was
code review from Steve Wang.
Yes. So there was some follow-up of the R1 CRD proposal. There was some additional comments in the doc. Wait a minute, Shanna, I'll share if you don't mind. I'll share.
Yes, absolutely. I'm catching up on that, and I have to follow up on the discussion. The first item of the agenda is basically to get this discussion forward.
So this is kind of, I think, what we discussed last time. You see my screen?
Yes, I do.
So this one I followed up upon. So there was, so there were comments in the document, but there was also things that were added by mainly Bernard, I think. I commented on that. I didn't see a reply on that yet.
Okay.
But these are more, so the comments are more like very futuristic things, so not directly related to R1, but more beyond R1, I would say. Like it was asking what skills do service provider need to have in order to build these packages and stuff like that. So that now, of course, depends a little bit on how to do it. So there was like questions along those lines.
Okay, excellent. And have we reviewed the comments in one of our meetings or no?
No, at the moment, these are individual comments that have been replied upon, but we have not reviewed them together, I believe.
Okay, no worries. And we are capturing these comments in this document, right?
Yes.
Okay,
I can
perfect.
show it to you if you want.
Yeah, maybe go over that and see if there is something that we need to follow up on. And I will continue my discussion following that subject.
See, for example, the things that were not commented upon were the ones here, right? You see here?
Yeah, right.
mapping roles to organization. Each role requires a specific expertise. Please highlight which expertise telco operators would need to acquire in order to be able to successfully fulfill the roles for the network service designer, network function engineer, and infrastructure engineer. Right? So I replied a little bit on that, but of course it's not a full-fledged answer probably, right? So that's one. The second one was sourcing artifacts. Please clarify what artifacts, CRD, CRs, kept functions are expected to be provided by vendors and which artifacts will be provided by Nefio community. Again, that depends a little bit. I put two extreme options. One is that they all come from the vendor. The other one is that they all come from Nefio or something like that. So, but you have.
There is a third possibility, Wim, to this, in my personal opinion. It could be a potential possibility that the cloud providers will give you CRDs for the cloud, and the network function vendor could give you CRDs for the network function deployment.
100%, yeah, 100%. And I basically said I just highlight two extremes here. So
right, makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm trying to currently play with the Nefio-like deployment with one of our vendors, and actually I'm going through this exercise at the moment.
Yes.
Which is interesting to explore because it's all unset at the moment.
Right. Then the scope of topology CR, right? What is their relationship and stuff like that. So here, yeah, I answered basically from what we have been discussing so far. Is topology CR is kind of a little bit, you could say, a contentious topic because we are in the service orchestration domain with that a little bit. So I think if you look to the seed code of Google, it has NF deploy inside, right? And so at the moment, it is more seen as let's say, a prototype of how it could be done rather than a full-fledged implementation. So
if I may comment on that,
yes, please.
I do believe that we need to come up with a sort of let's say, a certain guideline regarding where's the demarcation line regarding service orchestration and basically the orchestration of application processes.
Yeah.
And to my mind, I believe we could make use of a sort of a simplistic assumption where we say, just imagine that we've got a database process. There are certain requirements which need to be fulfilled so that you can start the database process. The database process could start with a sort of an empty schema definition. That means the process is up and running. It has got all its infrastructure resources, etc. Has all the required network connectivity, but it is basically not serving any kind of database instance, is not providing any access to any kind of database users.
Yeah.
Service orchestration on top of that would mean that you start sort of defining a database schema, defining access rights for certain users, etc.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, the network functions could be sort of regarded as the software processes which need to be instantiated and sort of be integrated into the infrastructure setup. But the service definitions and the service sort of specifications would then come after the software processes are up and running.
Mm-hmm.
So if we could come up with some kind of guideline in that direction, we would be able to more clearly distinguish between what's happening in the day 0, day 1 type of activities compared to what's happening in the service sort of lifecycle area.
Yeah.
And therefore, if possible, I think it would be nice to have some kind of guidance here to this sort of allow us to then talk about topology of application processes and possibly sort of relationships between services.
Sure. Yeah. Now, the question is, Bernard, how would we? Allow recording. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, we should have recorded it because now we.
Yeah, because Kaushik is not here, and I wanted to capture some of our discussions for our later review.
So Bernard, but yeah, Sana, you should maybe chime in. I personally agree with you. The question is, how do we accomplish that?
Right. So we have a plan on actually extending the working of this SIG to extend beyond R1 at this point in time and start looking into things beyond R1 and look at R2 and even an extended roadmap, which is something that we are discussing about. How would the nephew and this project, eventually how this is evolving, is going to interact with the rest of our standard-based service orchestrations. And I think, Eric, you were commenting, right? I could not see the screen because the screen is in full screen mode. This was Eric asking the question, right? Or Bernard?
Bernard.
Okay, Bernard, it's something that we have been discussing for quite some time. How would the nephew's convergence happen with the existing brownfield, the standards, the service orchestrations, the ones that are deployed and the ones that we are working with, and eventually even with the network slicing? So I have a vision on that, which I have internally proposed within my organization, how we are going to use nephew, and that would just be a proposal to the community. Then we can, of course, look into that and we can evolve and come up with our own proposal. On a very high level, in the beginning, when the project was going in Linux Foundation, there was a requirement for this new project, the nephew, to basically show some architectural diagram. How would that interact with the rest of the bigger projects, for example, ONAP? So some high level documentation is already available on that. But now we are going a layer deeper, peeling the onion so that we can actually identify the demarcation point a little bit more defined and a little bit applicable to the use cases that we are working with. So it's going to be an agenda item today. If you see in my typo notes, there is an item that I wanted to discuss, which is the product evolution beyond R1. And that includes one of this subject. How do we define our interactions with the service orchestration? How do we define those APIs? Where do we want the demarcation point? To your point, day 0, day 1 could be nephew, but is it possible to consider using a service orchestration layer to consider day 2 plus, where the network function is deployed, but now we are defining the service characteristics. If, for example, it's a 5G data plane service, and then some of the later on configurations could come from the service layer, because service layer has the end-to-end view of the applications involved, the transport layer. It has more visibility into how the different components are coming together. So it's going to be similar to the HC model to some extent in my mind. And I personally feel that nephew is going to replace the VNF manager scope within that, because a lot of our efforts and our work are really focused on the vertical network function deployment and configuration in any use case that we are considering at the moment.
Yeah.
Asana, if I checked a little bit here.
Absolutely.
So if you think about nephew as a VNFM from SC perspective, then we need to have above the VNFM, such as NFVO, in all NFO. So someone has to, so network function and will be stitched by the network services, I think. So initially we have a clear demarcation upper layer of the nephew. So if nephew focus on the network function, then we can consider some interface between nephew and the upper layer. It's not just a programmatic way, it's different way, like CR, CRD, that perspective. So we can use CRD creating the network function specific dynamic, the Kubernetes APIs through the nephew mechanism. But the network services, I think originally they said nephew will focus on NF, but now some of the discussion, they are touching some of the network service area, stitching the network function together. For example, for 5G, you need some kind of stitching together. So that means a demarcation a little bit below. So now we have to architecturally, when you design network service and above the service layer, we need to think about you mentioned end-to-end. So we need to think about how to support end-to-end, now programmatic way, the new way of the nephew, creating the CRD and CR base. That's kind of try to talk about this. Okay.
Right. So this gets me to another discussion. So this is going to be an ongoing discussion, Bernard. How do we fine-tune demarcation point in the context of nephew to say, if it is really a VNF manager, it's something beyond that? Even in today's world of brownfield, you might see sometimes the service orchestration layer is doing a little bit more than what it does. And those demarcation points are not 100% adopted, right? For certain use cases, we might do something more in one layer versus the other. At least I have seen in my personal experience a lot of overlap sometimes in how we are accomplishing our end-to-end automation goals. So this is going to be evolving in Nephew as well. And you see, currently we are driven by one use case, that is the 5G use case. If we have additional use cases ahead of us, for example, if we start considering the RAN use cases or some other use cases, we can probably come up with a much better consensus on building that demarcation in our future plans. So one of the ideas in today's agenda was also to get feedback from the community on what additional use cases should we include as parallel working groups. So I believe that will also help us get some more inputs into our architecture beyond just looking into the 5G use cases. Even if it is at the architectural level, like we are not going into the actual software development at the moment because of our limited focus on the R1 scope at the moment, but at least for this group, we have the liberty to extrapolate some of the requirements and some of the architectural points beyond just existing set of use cases. So that was my discussion with Kaushik to explore more and to basically come up with a more defined architecture in this layer.
Sana, one more. In Elephant DTF, I think there was Ama or somebody, they talk about the SC, they bring in the NFO and then, so, even talk about SOL 5 for the northbound of the NS, and then in NFVO, they talking to Nephew, they have to change the interface differently for Nephew, because we cannot use a SOL 3 API, which is not the Nephew, mechanism paradigm. So we are changing the paradigm shift, how to connecting that between Nephew and upper layer, not just using the used to be API, but now more dynamic API through the CID. So, I mean, that was discussed, but I commented that upper bound SOL 5 to NFVO is maybe we can reuse it. But the southbound, NFVO talking to Nephew, that will be totally changed. We don't follow SC. We don't follow SC. Agree. So yeah.
Absolutely agree. So in my perspective, Bernard, what I am doing internally within my organization is that I'm working with my SO. We use Tosca for the Tosca templates for developing our NSDs. So, and we are happy with that. Very happy, not changing that. But we do want to adopt Nephew as well at the same time. So what I'm doing internally, which is just only one example in my organization, is that we are building certain plugins to absorb the Nephew APIs. They're not SOL 3, of course, because SOL 3 and the plugins that we build to consume the Nephew APIs would be completely different. So I consider that as something that may fall outside the standards, and which is fine. Today, we have a lot of interaction happening with Kubernetes where we are using the native APIs within our SO, whatever SO you have in your site, which is not defined by a specific standard. So I don't know how the intersection of standards and our eventual evolution with Nephew will land. This question is a little beyond my imagination at this point in time. Will we drive the standards to include our requirements, or will we just stay as a parallel to that?
Yeah, Sana, if I may, so not to answer to you this question, that's a little bit more in depth. But you were talking about the beyond R1, right? Right. So I have a few things in my mind, so I just wanted to spell it out. So Nephew had 3 main swim lanes. So 3 main swim lanes are infrastructure orchestration, CNF orchestration, and CNF configuration. So R1 is barely touching the swim lane 2, which is CNF orchestration, that too not completely. So there are other 2 main swim lanes are totally untouched, which is infrastructure orchestration and the CNF configuration. So obviously those 2 are the huge topics for SIG architecture going forward beyond R1. And within the CNF orchestration itself, we are at this point of time, let's say, even within 5G, within CNF, within 5G, we are essentially focusing on three network functions: AMF, UPF, and what is the other one? So whatever, the three main stuff. So, but there are a lot of other network functions within the 5G code itself,
Of course.
such as slicing and stuff like that. The user management, slicing accounts. So we are not, at least at this point of time, we are not focusing on that. But Stephen had some other points, but which we will discuss later. But at this point of time, all those core functions are also not part of the R1 that we need to discuss the requirements in terms of their operations and deployment, and their how we want to provide the CRDs for them. That is one point. So obviously the other point that, like you said, another big area within 5G itself is we are only focusing on core, but we are also need to do the work on the RAN side. So that is a huge topic in itself. CU, DU, RU, their deployments, how they want to configure them, their deployment, very different deployment architectures as well, depending on the customers. So to me, those are the main topics beyond R1, but will still be in the realm of 5G, if you see, because 5G/4G, because all these topics are very huge topics.
Absolutely. And I do believe that we are, as this community, will also provide some recommendations on what we want to accomplish beyond R1, like what should be the scope of R2. And like we discussed with the automation SIG in the past, that whatever we recommend is not going to be something set in stone, but would be a proposal to the automation SIG to consider what is accomplishable and what is not. So if there is a big desire from the community to extend and make the 5G use case a little bit more mature, in the sense that we should really include the network function configurations and network function deployment and touch that a little bit more holistic way, which is actually functionally capable of doing something with it. We are at a very early stage in our, I think, development efforts at this point, right? So if that's what the direction is, I think we will propose that. If there is a bigger desire to include additional use cases and more vendors could contribute in, for example, there is a big push right now to start working on an ORAN working group. ORAN is super interested in finding their interactions with SMO and how would Nephew actually play a role there. For example, the O1 and O2 interfaces. So even for the sake of definitions, if we could look into that architecture and start discussing that in a separate thread, in a separate working group, I think that would be another useful exercise. We may or may not have something to develop in R2 for that, but this might influence some of our decisions at the architectural guiding level. So that was another topic on my mind to discuss with the group here.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alok actually pointed out, just going through the chat, I think one point is common, like the infrastructure orchestration, and Alok also points out in the chat that discussions on how to bring Helm support into Nephew. That's already, we have a working group about the gathering the requirements, about the what of that. That's another thing actually. Sana, Ericsson and Nokia, they proposed, I don't know whether you were present at that meeting when they did
yes,
that.
I have had a lot of discussion, Bernard, on that, a lot of discussions. And this was one of my items on agenda as well. So fill me in. What are our plans to go deeper into this topic? Are we waiting for their presentation and then gather the feedback from this community?
So my understanding is that by the R1 timeframe, we will get the requirements about what, not how. They may about these are the things that we want to do. This is why we need this, and these are the things we want to do from the Helm requirements perspective. And then there may be, at the same time, there may be subgroup that is also brainstorming about how to do it, whether to do it all the way in the beginning before the manifests are fed into the Nephew pipeline, or somewhere in between. There needs to be done in kept. So that is a separate discussion of how to accomplish that. So that may happen or that may not happen by the R1 timeframe, but what we need to do, that will definitely, I think, I think Nokia, Ericsson, they I think they're going to present it to us, the wish list.
Okay, so we have Wim here. Wim, do you know if you guys will be ready to present this topic in the next SIG meeting?
See, okay, so sorry, but there is more people on with their hands raised, by the way, but I'll answer this one.
Okay.
So
Okay.
this is a bit, I mean, we had at some point in the TSC, we were asked between both SIG 1 and 2, so meaning this SIG and then the automation, to look at this Helm, right? So we had a presentation from Kirian, which was done together with Ericsson and Nokia. So I'm my vice chair hat on, right? So I'm not presenting Nokia right now. So Kirian and Nokia did from Ericsson did a joint presentation on that in SIG 2. We created a subgroup because we now have subgroups in SIG 2. So, but I don't believe a lot of it is happening on it. What at some point I was suggesting to John, but at that point we already created the SIG 2 subgroup. After that meeting, when I was looking at it, I thought it would have been better to actually have SIG 1 look at this in terms of gathering the requirements and then jointly see how to address those requirements. So in other words, what I was proposing right now as an individual is, I think it would be better for this SIG to actually help figure out what the requirements are. And then once that is available, discuss it jointly between SIG 1 and SIG 2. So I can reach out to Kirian. So this is a long answer, sorry.
No, I get your answer. And I'm actually very supportive of what you discussed so far. Can you unshare your screen so that we can actually see who is raising hands and we can go to their hands as well? Right, perfect.
Yeah.
So I'll finish this thought and then I will go back to the questions which has raised hands. So we have a discussion to happen. Which working groups should be created under SIG 1? So I'll gather some feedback from the community on that subject today. And I believe that one of the groups should really be the group that gather the requirements on our support for Nephew,
yeah,
in whatever we want to do with our data models and everything in a much bigger context. We gather those requirements, and if those requirements are met by Helm and how, that's something that SIG group 2, the automation SIG should actually come up with the implementation level details. But what we need is definitely the function of this particular SIG. So one of the working groups should be focused on that, and we should gather requirements. And I'll work on doing that after I sync up with Kaushik, and we will create some additional source for that. Now, you guys have already presented in the SIG 2. I have already seen the presentation, but I don't know that this SIG and people here have seen that presentation. So we'll take this back and internally check with.
By the way, Sana, Kirian is on the call. He raised his hand, so maybe we should take him first.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah, let's take everyone's hand.
Yeah, but maybe Kirian first. I don't know whether other people want to talk about Helm, but maybe Kirian, I'm assuming.
We moved a little bit too fast here. We moved to Helm. I do want to talk about the previous issue, but let's finish this first and then move back.
Okay.
So I suggest Kieran speaks.
Yeah, apologies for joining late. I had some difficulties connecting. I'm on a business trip at the minute. I agree pretty much with Wim what you said there earlier. I think it would be good, and I'm trying to understand logistically how we should best drive this through the Nephew community. So that sounds like requirements gathering happens here in SIG 1, and then the implementation details, once the requirements have been decided, happens in SIG 2. Is that the way?
Yeah, I think philosophical, I think that's how we should look at it. So,
sounds good. And I'm happy enough to give the same presentation again at any point. I can either give it today if there's time, or the next instance of this session if there isn't time in this meeting.
So Shana, maybe we should at least either do it now or add Kirian to the agenda for the next meeting.
Right. We should definitely add Kirian to the agenda for the next meeting. How long is your presentation, Kirian?
The presentation itself is pretty short. It's only like 10 or 15 minutes, but I think the last time around in SIG 2, we ended up with quite a lot of debate and discussion.
Yes,
I think it took
and I expect that to happen here. Right. I expect that to happen here as well. So what will happen is that after those 15 minutes, we'll dedicate the rest of the time to gather feedback from the community. And I would like to have that feedback documented as well. So we'll find a mechanism on how we can document the responses, because this feedback that we receive in this SIG will actually formalize the requirements, which I'm anticipating would be a very critical feedback. So let's dedicate our next meeting to this topic of Helm, and we'll park it for now. But if there's any other raised hands to catch up on any of the things that we discussed, I think we should start moving to that as well.
Tal is next.
Okay, thank you. So back to the previous topic regarding service orchestration. So we don't see the share anymore, but Wim put an interesting comment on the document. I want to point out that we're actually farther ahead than where we think. Already in the summit and now in Google Seed Code, we have a component that has been changing its name a little bit a few times, but some people have been calling it a mini SO, which is a little bit of a problematic term. We're trying to call it now a topology controller. The point is that, I'll put it this way, right? We do need within Nephew a way to simulate something like a higher level orchestrator. And obviously there's huge diversity in these. You know, you mentioned ONAP and of course, many, many other products that are being used in OSS and orchestration. We're not intending this component, which we're, I guess, calling now topology controller, to be a replacement for any of those. It is an internal part of Nephew to allow us to do more, move more towards the end-to-end orchestration, right? Allow some aspects of service orchestration. And this is something that we can build on looking towards R2, including things like adding Tosca, right? I think everybody knows that I'm very interested in the topic.
Right.
Do that. So the design of that, you know, we can continue talking about how it looks, including interactions with ORAM, right? As that could be a place where O2 IMS implementation from Nephew would live, or parts of it at least. There's the whole issue of infrastructure orchestration as well. So this right now is a very, very bare bones component. It intends to do purposely very, very little, just to give us a way within Nephew to do testing, to do kind of end-to-end testing, by which I define end-to-end within the scope of Nephew, right? Not end-to-end more generally speaking. But yeah, we should definitely continue iterating on that. But I just want to point out that it's not a topic that we've completely ignored, and it actually will exist to an extent in R1 through the Google Seed Code, just in a very, very minimal, purposely minimal way. And we're not trying to put facts on the ground and not involve SIG #1 here. I do want to keep emphasizing that this is a very minimal component that the purpose doesn't try to do a lot, but it could definitely do more in R2.
Could we have a presentation of the concepts and the design also in one of our meetings here?
Yeah, we can definitely do that. I think we actually did see that in part of the Seed Code presentations that Stephen did 2 weeks ago. But we didn't really phrase it maybe in this way, right? We call it the NF topology controller or NF deployment controller. That's basically what it does. But we can definitely revisit that with this different look in mind, right? The point I'm trying to make is that there wasn't a huge thinking in terms of orchestration when we designed this component, but in terms of content, this is where this topic lives right now. So we can revisit that for sure.
Right. Tol, another question that is coming to my mind after your comment is that if the Google Seed Code has some topology controller that is touching the SO functionality to some point, are we in a position to start looking into the big picture? Like in one of our discussions under SIG 1, will that be giving us some data where we are aligned on the Nephew scope? So we can't implement everything, but we have to be aligned on the scope of Nephew at some point in time, because that will help a lot of the people in the industry to see where Nephew is coming from and where Nephew will end, and what the rest of the components we need to merge in terms of our brownfields.
You're absolutely right. So I'll just emphasize again for the 100th time, just to be 100% clear that right now, the scope of it is so limited that it absolutely does not violate anything, right? We're calling it mini SO is a little bit of a scary thing. It's not really an SO, not even a mini SO. So SIG number 1 will define the scope, right? So really treat this as a tool right now for internal lab testing for Nefio. But if SIG number 1, well, really the TSC defines the scope of Nefio to reach into the underlying layers of service orchestration, then that's probably the component where we will be working on it. But so far, other than our discussions, we have not designed anything. We've definitely had presentations about Tosca, and we've thought about these topics, but I don't think the community as a whole has really decided anything. It's really hard to look to R2 right now when R1 is being very hotly developed right now. But it doesn't mean we can't start talking about these topics and considering them and seeing if Nefio's scope can be increased just a little bit, right? Again, reaching into the underbellies of SO. We have no intention of creating another ONAP, I think, within this community, but to see how we can. Sometimes I call it thickening the platform, right? Reaching up from the platform and making it easier for service orchestration to interact with Nefio. So if that's the goal, we can design based on that principle. But I don't think anybody here really wants to create another mini SO, something like I forgot the name of the project that spun off from ONAP, the Intel project. I'm blanking on its name.
And that didn't take.
Ecomp?
Oh yeah, no, not Ecomp. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting it. It was spun off from the
EMCO you're talking about?
Yeah, EMCO. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so the EMCO project was really intended to be a mini SO, and early on in FEO, there were discussions about maybe doing something. So I don't think anybody in this community wants to reinvent wheels and create yet another attempt to approach service orchestration in open source. So I'm just emphasizing we have to be very careful about the scope of that, but within some limited scope that we define very carefully, I think there's room to do something useful.
Right, Tol. And I think more than that, would be very interesting to see how do we develop the interaction with the actual SO, if that has to exist. And I do recall that you wanted to present on Tosca, which could have given us some direction on how would the Tosca layer interact with the Nefio APIs eventually. And I am still very interested in that discussion because it will help us merge with the existing brownfield. So is there a possibility that we could still keep that discussion on one of our future agenda tracks?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, your SIG number 1, you define the agenda. So if this is something you want to continue looking into, I can definitely create some sort of proposal and we can discuss.
Right. This will be definitely one of the follow-up agendas. After we finish this Helm discussion in the next meeting, maybe the follow-up discussion should be this, unless Kaushik has something else that he brings up, which I will do my best to bring this, the Tosca plus the mini SO or our eventual demarcation point between the Nefio and the rest of the orchestration. Everybody's curious about that. So we'll dedicate one discussion to that, which is going to be centered around your discussion of Tosca.
Thank you. Yeah, I could try to lead a discussion myself and Stephen, and we can prepare something. Absolutely. Just let us know when you want it on the agenda, and we'll set something up.
Excellent, Tom.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the group? I see some raised hands.
Yeah, Bernard
so if I may, I would have one request. Sort of all the activities which we're conducting at some point in time need to be, all these results which we are sort of obtaining need to be applied to our real world scenarios. And I'm always trying to understand what would I sort of tell to my vendors, what would I tell to my DevOps team on how to apply the Nefio principles, Nefio ideas and assets. And I'm currently still struggling, and that was also, by the way, the reason, Wim, why I raised these questions in this document. When we're developing something, somehow we need to make sure that we can apply these concepts to the roles and responsibilities of our future setups. And that was, from my perspective, one of the reasons why we started with these user journeys, trying to explain if we are now sort of applying these NEFIO results, then sort of the vendor ideally would have to take care of this. The DevOps team would need to take care of that. And then based on that, we can then sort of streamline the way of how we are onboarding and managing sort of our future network solutions.
Right, right. Finish your thought, Bernard, then I'll comment.
For that purpose, I believe we need to have also a comprehensive view of the whole life cycle of what we're trying to manage, and then sort of pinpoint the scope which we're currently trying to address. So currently, for instance, we're not addressing how we get the resource and assets into our infrastructure, into our sort of runtime environments. We're not talking about how we do sort of life cycle management in the context of errors occur and we need to take care of them. But these all belong to sort of the whole lifecycle management concept, which we as an operator have to take care of. And if we're not taking sort of a clear point on how we would like to distribute responsibilities, then basically the results are you can do it like this, or you can do it the other way around, depends. And then sort of basically we have no real guidelines. There's so many options to go for. And then NEFIO would be just another option like current Helm sort of rollouts, which we're currently doing. So there needs to be some kind of sort of recommendation coming also out of this sort of domain. That means if you're going for the NEFIO approach, this is how you ideally would make use of the results. And that is something which I'm currently missing.
Right. Bernard, I'll walk you through my thought process. So every time in the SIG 1, we focus on an agenda, we focus on a topic, there should be an output or document attached to our discussion. So for example, if we do the Helm discussion in the next SIG meeting, we'll review the presentation, we will gather the requirements from the community. But what should be the output of that discussion is a requirements document, which of course is not going to be 100% day one, but which could be an evolving document, which should be an output of our discussions that we did at that point in time, which will gather some of your feedback that you are missing in any of our topics, right? When we get to the second round of discussion, maybe in another one of the future SIG meetings where we talk about the brownfield convergence, where we talk about Etsy, our Sol 3, Sol 5 APIs, Tosca, and what's done in the seed code that Tol was talking about, we review the discussions, but the output of that should be a preliminary architectural view on where fits NEFIO, what is the demarcation point for NEFIO, where is there a gray line? Even if there is a gray line, that's fine, but we have to call it out. So we have some documentation in hand. So we'll produce another documentation at the end of that discussion. And to your third point, basically, R1 is a very limited focus in which we did not complete the full lifecycle management of even the 5G functions that we talked about. So if we have some strong recommendations that could actually be short-term for R2 to consider, building on R1, we could create another document. These are our short-term R2 recommendations that we want the SIG 2 to consider, which could be some additional configuration elements on the 5G core, which we did not touch in R1. So maybe that's another document that we can create just for the focus of the R2, which is strengthening the existing use cases that we have developed in R1, but which are not complete, to your point.
Okay.
So I'm taking notes of my whatever I said, and we have to continue producing these documents. And these documents will be living documents, and they'll exist on our internal shared folders, and we can constantly evolve that. And we can even revisit those topics if something changes our perception or our understanding. But at least there will be a common understanding of how we are, what is our common understanding of those spaces.
By the way, it's Wim here, Sana. I also raised my hand, but so I think Bernard, I think on the roles and responsibilities, I believe you had prepared a presentation at some point which was going into some of these topics, not? And I don't think you had the chance to present it.
Yes, I did sort of develop that. It's only a proposal, but I believe it's not about sort of if it's exactly like this, but it's about we need to come up with a conclusion of how we ideally would split responsibilities. Because I know of some of our NatCos, they don't have the engineering capabilities. They don't have the capabilities of defining complex network solutions. They would like to have this life as easy as possible. And they are asking for recommendations of how would we sort of do lifecycle management in the future. And sort of, I'm always saying, look, your nephew is sort of developing something. Let's see how that works out. But we need to give them recommendations. Yeah, and that's why I'm very much in favor of getting this notion of how would we do lifecycle management, who would be responsible for what, how would these things work together.
Yeah.
Right.
My question was more, Bernard, does it still make sense for you to present that? I had the feeling of yes, but I want to ask you maybe.
Yeah, I think it would make sense. It's giving a more like sort of a target picture type of view. And the question is, when will those concepts, I'm not expecting that everything will be adopted right away, but if we can have a common sort of North Star type of view, that I believe that would make sense and give also the whole community a certain direction. Currently, we're more bottom up, trying to see what can be done within each time slot, yeah, R1, R2, etc. But I think it would also make sense to say, where do we want to be in a certain time frame, and then try to gradually evolve in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Luciana, maybe because I think the Helm presentation, I don't know, I mean, does it make sense to also have Bernard present his thing or somewhere on the next meeting, or?
No, Bernard's presentation should require another full dedicated session. And I think once we go through this Helm discussion, and so I'm not prioritizing, I'm just speaking out loud my thoughts here. There are some short-term things which are trying to build the big picture, and then there are some longer-term things. So I believe the roles and responsibilities, if I'm not mistaken, we'll also gather voting from the community. I believe this is not a short-term objective. Maybe in a few SIG meetings, we can get to the point where we can look into the roles and responsibilities. And Bernard, please chime in if you think that it's a more urgent issue to resolve. We need to align. We need to prepare from our organizations. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. If I may just comment quickly. So what I do believe is that sort of coming to a common conclusion will take its time. Yeah, and I believe to generally get the gist of in which direction should we be aiming for, we should start soon, because we have been sort of postponing this discussion for quite a while. And I'm not saying that we need to do that before the Helm presentation, but I do believe that we shouldn't sort of postpone it over and over again, because otherwise I will at least have a certain difficulty explaining my management sort of what are the results of the nephew community if I cannot sort of give some kind of direction in sort of what it will ultimately try to achieve. Yeah, and that's why I'm a little bit wanting to press this topic sort of that we need to come up with a conclusion of how we would like to see the future of lifecycle management work out.
Yeah, Bernard, your point is taken. We should definitely include that in one of our few next 2-3 agenda items, and we'll give you the floor, present the topic, and of course we will also gather some requirements from the community on the roles and responsibilities from their perspective. And Bernard, one more question that was coming to my mind, that it would be a good thought leadership from one service provider to actually propose an idea and to walk us through that. But there will always be differences in how the adoption of nephew happens across the world, right? Yes. Some service providers are very, very software centric. They have a large force of software developers and they're taking the template development in-house. We have a big expertise of Helm development even within our groups right now, and we are fighting with vendors on getting the requirements, the artifacts, the CRDs, and we are bypassing VNF managers as well. This is the story of my side, but there are so many other service providers where the vendors are taking all the responsibility for the top-down full integration, deployment of the network function, services creation, the templates, everything is owned by the vendors. So we can propose a good, basically, idea on how the roles and responsibilities are defined. Who does that? I think might be very different in every organization. So maybe we'll discover.
I fully agree, but that's why I also added in this questions which I added to Wim's document regarding what kind of expertise would be needed here. That means
Right.
if we can talk about sort of there are certain tasks which need to be done, we can then later on say, based on the expertise, either sort of a vendor would be doing it or potentially also sort of a telco operator. But of course, a telco operator will never have the detailed knowledge about the network functions. And I would expect simply that certain things are in natural sort of domain of the CNF vendors to manage this information. That's why I'm wanting to come up with a, sort of
exactly.
rough guideline of how that could fit up.
Let's build that rough guideline, because without that, I think we don't even know where to target for the change, right? On a very high level, I'm not concluding, but I'm just making one comment, is that my personal feeling is that where Helm is coming from for the network function deployment is where the CRD for the network function deployment is going to come from, because that application level knowledge would not be there in the cloud providers and would not be there in the service provider space. It has to be with the application vendors space. And the cloud providers will know more about their clouds, so maybe they can configure and they can create CRDs for that. And where I want personally, my own feeling is that service providers should take the ownership of the service layer eventually. We should have enough openness to the configuration and our CRDs at that the service definition layer, where service owners can actually take the ownership of defining their services their way with whatever matters to them, and not give this to vendors to basically accomplish that, because that will create uniqueness in development, right? It's my wish.
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's see.
Yeah, I also raised my hand with respect to this topic, Bernard, because the framework that we have so far for R1, right? And actually, so Tal actually should get the credit for it, because he was the one suggesting it. Is we use a concept of packages with CRDs in it, right? And I believe that the concept is flexible. So in other words, as Sana was saying, there is certain organizations which want to be everything abstracted, and there is other organizations who want to have more control, right? My belief is that with that framework, we have the building blocks to do both, okay? Which is actually nice, right? Because if it's too abstracted, then the people who want to actually have a certain control over it cannot do it. Whereas, whereas otherwise, you also create some problems. So in other words, what I'm actually saying or trying to say is that at the moment we made it flexible, which means that for the people who want to make it abstracted, its initial version is probably not good enough, right? But what you can do is build an abstraction on top of that to make it good for that set of people. I don't believe that in R1, we will have the scenarios for the ones where it's fully abstracted, but we have the openness. And if we have the open approach, building from open to something that is more abstracted is easier than if you build it abstracted and then you have to open it up. So as such, so that's my view on the current situation. So in other words, if you say certain nutcalls, they have no clue about design and they want to have it all packaged all together and cookie cutter and just reuse it, I don't believe that R1 in its scope has that target yet, but we could build towards that.
Yeah, so just to clarify, in Deutsche Telekom, we've got the full range of sort of large organizations capable of doing all the engineering and integration parts, and small nutcos which are very sort of limited in the capabilities of supporting that. And we have to sort of address both scenarios. But what we need to understand is that if somebody says, I want to do the integration part as well, then we need to understand what kind of expertise is needed for that. And on the other side, how would the vendors who are providing the building blocks have to support this integration approach? Yeah, because if we are handing over sort of CRDs which have 5,000 parameters, then basically, even if you're very knowledgeable about how to integrate things, you will need a lot of time to do the integration because you cannot easily understand the 5,000 parameters. Yeah.
We still don't understand that, Bernard. In the Helm chart values files, we still don't get that. We are still working with vendors to understand the thousands of lines in the values files and how we are changing it from site to site. And this knowledge is something very, very vague even today.
Yes. And so I think, see, over time, so for example, if you look to topology, right, it's actually to one end, it gives you mini as yeah, I used the word mini as well. Maybe I should not have done it, but it gives a little bit of an abstraction on the top level, right? So it's a way to do certain level abstractions together with let's say interdependencies and stuff like that. So you could think, and that's why I always said you could think of tools that we build on top of what we have in R1 to satisfy that second category of people, right? And to slowly but surely get to that more abstracted world that certain people want. So that's something we can definitely work towards. As I said, R1 probably is not doing that completely, but I think we have the building blocks to get there.
Great. Let's focus on this topic in our dedicated discussion. We'll put that on the agenda tracker. I'll leave it to the voting for the community. Next SIG, we are focusing on the Helm discussion, but following that, we have a TOSCA plus SO, mini SO discussion to see how the brownfield convergence is happening, and also the Bernard's discussion on the roles and responsibilities and how Nephew is going to be used within our organizations. One more discussion which we didn't find time for in today's meeting was my feedback gathering from the community on how we should create additional working groups under SIG 1. The way I'm seeing, one working group should really be focused on the requirements for deploying our network functions and configurations, like the roles for Nephew. What is our requirement on achieving that, which is going to basically give inputs to the Helm discussion. One working group could be for ORAN. I'm just speaking it out loud. I want your feedback, like how we should create the additional working groups under SIG 1. And I'll have this discussion with Kaushik as well. We need to propose that to TSC after we have some initial brainstorming done.
Yes, and if you can prioritize what are the main important things, just like you said, Helm is one, is it ORAN or is it service orchestration where if you can prioritize for the immediate one or next two releases, then probably we can come up with the idea what each subgroup should be doing.
Right. Bala, one of the discussions in the TSC that happened between our leaders was that because SIG 1 has the liberty to see things in a big picture, because we are not bound by the implementation timelines and details, so we can actually look at things beyond R2, R3 as well. Like for some of our document creation or architectural diagrams, like the way the telco world is not sometimes driven by just the focus of the direct implementation of the software that they are focused on, but they can also look at the big picture and how the standards can come together. So our proposal was that we will start working on aligning some architecture and vision, existing standards, the brownfield convergence. So the ORAN group, one of the working group that we were discussing, would actually identify Nephew's role in the context of O1 and O2 interfaces, and we are all the time receiving input from people who are working in the ORAN Alliance on how Nephew fits in our model. Basically to brainstorm on some of those ideas, and that working group can actually produce some documentation which could become an input to ORAN Alliance for the cross community understanding on how Nephew fits in the big picture.
Okay, thanks.
Right. So different working groups can focus on different things. One working group is fitting ourselves and how it can support something for Nephew, ORAN. The other working group can actually come up with an idea on a very high level. How would Nephew fit in the existing brownfield of service orchestration and network slicing, which is what I was discussing with all. So I'm just thinking about how many working groups do we need? Use case centric or cross community collaboration centric, or the product evolution centric, maybe something focused purely on R2 requirements. With that, we can actually divide our focus, and we can bring some parallel activity within the SIG 1, like this is happening in SIG 2 at the same time.
Yes, and I think it's a good food for thoughts. I think we should think over this. I think because we reached the end of our meeting, I guess.
Right, right.
So yeah, thanks. And I think probably yeah, we can think along those lines. Provide feedback to you.
Absolutely. I'll sync up with Kaushik. We'll create some additional proposals on how we want additional SIGs to be created. And I think we'll bring our ideas to the forum again. Until then, I've gathered some good feedback on today's discussion.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, take care.
Take care, guys.